I read 7 books in the month of February, which is neither groundbreaking nor revolutionary, but 3 of the 7 books I read, I gave 5 stars to. And if I went digging through my statistics to find out the last time that happened, let me tell you, I would be looking for quite some time because I only had 7 5-star reads throughout the entirety of 2025. 2 of the books that I read in February were also rereads, which is something that I used to do a lot. Now I average maybe a maximum of 3 rereads per year. So it truly was an interesting reading month, but I am going to hop straight into the statistics. In February, I read a total of 7 books that added up to 3,053 pages, which breaks down to an average of 109 pages per day. For the star ratings, I had 2 3-star reads, 2 4-star reads, and 3 5 stars, breaking down to my biggest average in a very long time of 4.14 stars per book. And I actually think that at least one of those 5 stars is really going to surprise you guys. For the demographics, still only reading adult books this year, all 7 of them were adult. For the formats, I read 2 ebooks, 2 physical books, I listened to an audiobook, read 1 arc, and also 1 novella. For the genres, I read 3 fantasy books, 2 romantasy, 1 lit fic, and 1 contemporary romance. For the places where I source these books from, which is my most exciting start at the minute because I've changed the way that I do this, but I read 3 books from Kindle Unlimited, 1 was a subscription box book, 1 was a book that I bought brand new, 1 was a book that I received from a publisher, and 1 was a book that I purchased secondhand. And in terms of how long these books had been on my TBR, 4 of them were from my existing TBR that existed prior to the start of 2026, and 3 of them were from my digital library, so books that I don't own physical copies of or borrowed from a service like Kindle Unlimited. So going into the books, the first book that I read was one of my 5 stars, and it's one that I started in January and wrapped up this month. It's my favorite book of the year so far, and it is The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson. So I read this for the last episode of Shelve It or Scrap It, where I read other booktubers' favorite books of 2025, and this is the book that had come up the most often across people's best books list. So, you know, I knew it was going to be good, but me giving out a 5-star rating doesn't happen too often. So this one is an adult fantasy novel, and it's set in this world where the emperor has a certain span of time that he can reign, and the emperor, I think he's called Burson, has come to the end of his reign now. So they're holding a competition to pick the next person who is going to be the emperor. In this world, there are 8 different gods. So when they hold this competition, they have a contender that worships each of the gods, and they tend to represent the tenets of the god because they have also trained in the monasteries of the gods in a particular field. So for example, our main character, who is the Raven Scholar, is a member of the Ravens, and that means that she is especially interested in things like information, documentation. Her job is actually that she's one of the, I don't want to say advisors to the emperor, but she kind of deals with a lot of his legal matters, and she is tasked with investigating when one of the contenders is killed. So going through the process of investigating this murder, she uncovers a lot more than she expected to, and discovers that there may be some corruption in the empire that she was previously unaware of. Somebody who helps her out with this investigation is the representative for the Foxes, who is actually also an ex-lover of hers, and we do get to a point throughout this book where it becomes more fantastical as the gods start to get involved with this process of competition. So this book did something that I really love in that it has a clear structure for you to follow as you are exploring and learning about the world. So in this, of course, is the competition, the trials, and as each trial plays out, we also follow our main character on the sidelines digging into this murder. The reason why I love this in fantasy is because, especially when it comes to the first book in a series, it gives the book real focus and real structure while we are learning about the fantastical world. And my favorite thing about this was the writing and also the atmosphere. Antonia Hodgson is an author who is actually known for writing in the crime genre. Antonia Hodgson up until this point has not been a fantasy author, but this felt so organically and immersively fantasy that it was like Antonia Hodgson had been writing fantasy for her entire career. I did eventually see the influence of her crime background, however, with the way that the plot unfolded. I think that she does a very good job of leading you into false directions and then kind of like redirecting you at the last minute. There were things that happened in this book which in and of themselves were not the most dramatic revolutionary events, but the way that Antonia Hodgson led them to you made them feel like this really grand reveal. The narrative was predominantly following our main character of Nima, but I really loved the style in which the narration switched up from time to time, kind of pulling back and giving you an overview before zooming in to what a different specific character was doing. And this is how we gained a little bit more information about the world outside the perspective of Nima. So while we're following her investigation, we're also following other people and their potential role that they've played in this murder, or something that's going on in the background that contributes to current events that you wouldn't get solely from Nima's perspective. But the style in which we switched up that narration and switched up perspective really lent itself to the atmosphere of this book. We do have a secondary character embedded within the narrative, shall we say. I don't really want to give anything away about this, but that character was kind of self-pitying but in a really funny way, which provided some comedic relief and also really lent into the fantastical elements of this that I loved. I really loved the character of the Fox contender and the dynamic that he and Nima had, because they do have a background and a history that really plays into their dynamic, but also Nima is quite a serious, studious person, while Kane, being the representative of the Foxes, is a little bit more of a trickster. He's cheeky, he's more lighthearted, and the way that he knew which specific buttons to press when it came to Nima, and the way that he constantly slightly irritated her but in a really endearing way, I really loved. I also really like the way that Antonia Hodgson manipulates the reader in here. This has kind of a false start, which I don't really want to go too much into that, but essentially as a reader, when you are introduced to a character, you are kind of inclined to believe that they are the good guy unless you've been told otherwise. Like, putting yourself directly in their perspective endears you to them because you get their inner monologue. And I liked the way that throughout this book Antonia Hodgson kind of flipped that on its head. So the preconceptions that you kind of go into at the start of this book are challenged very, very quickly as you start to explore the narrative. And I think that one of the reasons why this was so effective in gripping my attention and also consistently taking me by surprise is because I already had those preconceptions built in, and the further we went in and uncovered more about the plot, the more that preconception was challenged. So I am very excited for the sequel of this. I don't know if it has a release date yet. I'm so glad that I read it. For such a thick book, it was so immersive and so engaging. I have said this before, but writing style is something that is incredibly important to me. The phrase that I tend to use is that I can read well written shit. Like, the book doesn't have to be good as long as the writing is engaging and atmospheric, then I'm going to have a good time reading it regardless of if I even enjoy the story. But the good news with this book is that it really is the whole package, and the plot, the world, and the characters also delivered. The next book that I read was my first reread, and this goes hand in hand with a book that I read later in the month because I reread Blood and Steel by Helen Shura, which I read in spring last year for the Romantasy rundown, and then later in the month I read Vows and Ruins for the first time, which is the second book in this series. So The Legends of Thezmar is a Romantasy series. It's following a young woman in a world where a prophecy that said that a woman that wields a blade is going to bring about the end of days essentially removed all female warriors in this world. If they were already warriors, then they were kind of retired and sent on to do other things, and no girls are allowed to train anymore. However, our main character's dream is to become one of the warriors of Thezmar and maybe eventually become one of the elite warriors who are the legends. So she essentially has to petition the royalty of the world. She gets this opportunity to be granted granted an exception to be able to train, and through a series of events she does actually succeed in that, and she ends up training with the warriors of Thezmar. However, because it's been a couple of decades since they've had women in their ranks, they are now incredibly sexist, and the way that they treat Althea goes past the regular hazing of the warriors. And to make matters worse, she has to very closely work with one of the surliest and also most uptight of the legends, which is Wilder Hawthorne. So this is a romantasy story, so I'm pretty sure you can kind of see where this is going to go. So when I read Blood and Steel for the first time, I gave it 4 stars, and I stuck with that rating the second time around. Helen Shara's books are actually very easily readable. They're quite lengthy, but I feel like they pass very quickly, and they contain a lot of tropes that I really enjoy in the romantasy genre. So I do like the kind of guard archetype and the love interest. If you think someone like Chaol from Throne of Glass, you know, opinions change on him throughout the series, but back in the day when he was the main guy, he was also my main guy, and that is a trope that I do quite enjoy and have also encountered in a book that I only finished at the beginning of March. So you're gonna have to wait for that because it's a Shelvados Grappit book, so I don't want to reveal what it is, but that is something that I do enjoy in a love interest. It also has, of course, the Warrior Academy, which I love. It forms a similar structure to a series of trials or a competition, and like with that, I find it's really good for helping to establish a world and kind of ease you into it. I really liked our main character of Thea, and then we also have this very clear like wider plot that is going to unfold when you get past book 1. However, I will say with this series that while I do love all of those tropes, I have seen them all executed better in different series that I've read. So this for me at this point serves as something that kind of scratches the itch and hits all of those points, but it's not executing any of them better than I've seen it done before. So it's not like quite a favorite series for me. 2, I did rate slightly lower. I gave it 3 stars. I was forewarned in my comments that it is a very smut heavy book, and this is the series that we are reading for my Patreon book club, the Alpha Hole book club. So I am making spoiler vlogs that I'm posting over on Patreon. I actually did a smut counter, and we had 7 or 8 smutty scenes in book 2 alone, and it was a little bit much because at that point it's almost 10%. There were points where it was less than 5% between sex scenes, and I do enjoy a little bit of smut, but I do have my limit, which I did explore in the video or the video series should I say, where I read book 1 in this series, which is the romantasy rundown. I'll link you guys if you want to kind of catch up on that, because I read a bunch of books, rated their spiciness, and kind of decided what it was that I enjoy in the romantasy genre. And the thing that also particularly frustrated me about the amount of explicit content in book 2 is that a key part of being a warrior of Thezmar is that you can't fraternize. Like, they're supposed to be celibate, but they're especially not supposed to have any relations within the guard. It's a conflict of interest. Like, their dominant responsibility and their loyalty is supposed to be to the realm. In case there's any kind of threat, like, their priority has to be protecting the civilians of the realm, not the person that they're attached to. So they're not supposed to have a relationship to start off with, which does create a really good kind of conflict. I love me a little bit of a forbidden romance, like people who are pining for each other, but for whatever reason they can't be together. But the narrative of book 2 very much followed the structure from both of their perspectives of, oh no, we can't be together because of XYZ, like we have to perform our jobs and I can't train you properly if we're involved. And then in that same chapter, it would be like, I love you forever, we can never be apart. And it wasn't adding up for me. It did feel like a little bit of smut over substance, which I do prefer the plot to be more forward in my romantasy. The same comment that warned me about the content in this book, though, did let me know that it does calm down a little bit in books 3 and 4, which are also a little bit shorter, but given the direction that they're going with off the back of book 2, I can definitely understand why there would be less sexual content in there. So I am currently looking forward to continuing. In March, I'm going to be reading the prequel story in this series, which now that I've figured out from reading the main series who it follows, I'm even more interested in diving into that one. And then later on, I will continue on with the rest of this series. And hopefully I enjoy the end a little bit more, because if I hadn't have been warned that there is less smut in the books going forward, I think I would have been quite reluctant to continue this one. I then reread my favorite contemporary romance of all time. So I did say we had 3 stars in February. This one was kind of a given given. So like when it comes to my best books of the year list, this is not going to be included because it was just a reread for me. But the reason why I reread is, I mean, I've been wanting to for a long time, but I also wanted to annotate it. I've never annotated before. And with romance being a genre that when I love it, I feel like I get the most emotionally invested in it, I felt like it would be a good call to reread a contemporary romance so I know I'm invested and I know that I love it, and like kind of try and work through an annotation process. I made a full video on this, but I am so happy with how this turned out. In the video, I go a little bit into kind of what I was looking for when I was reading this, the supplies that I used based on recommendations that I'd had. Also, if you haven't read this book, I gave you like a bite-sized review and also a little synopsis of it. But I'm just so obsessed. I honestly did not think that I would enjoy this experience as much as I did. And since I've done this, I want to annotate everything, and it's becoming a problem because I don't feel like I should annotate books unless I know that I love them, because you guys know how high my turnover of books is that I read, and it's like, okay, I don't need to keep this. I don't want to be defacing books that I'm going to be giving away to other people, you know? But anyway, this, my favorite contemporary romance of all time, is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. And this one is an office romance. It's hate to love, but like they are low-key enemies because they go out of their way to antagonize each other constantly. But essentially they were the assistants to the CEO of two separate publishing companies. The companies merged and the CEOs kept their own assistants. So they sit in the same room facing each other all day, every day, despising each other. Each of these companies had very different ethoses. The one that Josh worked for considers books as units, like profitable units, and the one that Lucy worked for considers literature as art. And so they have very different viewpoints on life, and it is very much represented by who they are as people. And the animosity between them really comes to a head when there is an opportunity for promotion within the company, but that promotion is going to put one of them directly above the other. So they make a pact that if one of them gets the promotion, then the other one is going to resign because they could not stand to work for each other. But, and the first line, I always say this, the first line of this book, if you want to know how this book is going to play out, it says, "I have a theory. Hating someone feels disturbingly similar to being in love with them." And that is this book in a nutshell. Now, I did give this one a 5-star rating in honor of the 5-star that I gave it the first time that I read it. I have to discuss this extensively, like in the past, but also recently, directly in relation to this book. But my relationship with the romance genre has altered over recent years because of some like medication that I'm taking that has altered my hormones. And so I still thoroughly enjoyed this one, but I didn't have that wholehearted obsession with it that I had the first time around. Like, this had me in a book hangover for days. I was pining after this man for weeks after reading this. I watched the movie like 3 or 4 times because I didn't have time to reread the book, but I wanted like a speed run of the plot. And this time around, like, I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I didn't have that level of investment. Something that I really love about this is Lucy's narrative, and I don't want to be that bitch, guys, but I feel like writing styles don't exist anymore. I've read a lot of books, especially like these two, that have very, very distinctive writing styles this month. And like I said when I was talking about this, if a book is well written, I am immediately absorbed and immediately engaged. And I feel like a lot of writing these days in the newer releases that I'm reading especially, but also just like generally in a lot of books that I'm picking up, it's kind of just words on a page. Like, it doesn't have a distinct flair or style. So when I encounter a book that has that, I'm like, wow, this is like really engaging. And Lucy's narrative in here, I love. I feel like it does take a little bit of getting used to, but if you guys do not know this about me, there are 2 very formative things that I encountered in my childhood that have formed my vocabulary especially, but also like a key part of who I am as a person. One is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The other one is the Confessions of Georgia Nicholson book series by Louise Renison. And there are certain books that I've read over recent years where I feel like I can tell that the authors are also big fans of Georgia Nicholson. This is one of them. The other one is the Brown Sisters trilogy by Talia Hibbert, which I assume that transfers to a lot of Talia Hibbert's writing, but that is personally at this point all I've read from her, and I love that series. But the way that Lucy has these kind of little asides that seem so bizarre in the moment but really add to the humor of the novel reminded me so much of Georgia Nicholson. And you know, she's my girl. I love me a bit of Georgia, and I love seeing that influence, or what I'm assuming is that influence, in other fiction. So I found Lucy to be so funny, and this is the start of my love of the he falls first trope, which is something that I've encountered repeatedly in Ali Hazelwood's books since I've read this, but this was the starting point for me, and I feel like it is so masterfully done. You have in here my favorite pairing of a female character who is so preoccupied with everything in her life that she cannot see like what is 2 feet in front of her face, and somebody who is more quiet and reserved and doesn't really know how to express themselves, kind of dealing with this more chaotic personality. It's also a grumpy sunshine pairing as well, which Ali Hazelwood is also known for. Something that I really enjoy about this as well is that Josh is not the perfect love interest. He is so deeply flawed, and that is part of the reason why him and Lucy have so many issues at the beginning of this book. And as you dive into it and as you get to know him a little bit better, you can directly trace that back to like his relationship with his family, the way that his father is, and some of the familial interactions that you see in this book are very uncomfortable to read, especially when you start to draw that direct line between Josh and his father, and you kind of see how he is a flawed person and how he's trying to be better, but he still has that upbringing kind of in him. And I liked the complexity of character that provided. I feel like this is a very engaging narrative because of the writing style, but I like that we don't have these really boring, bland, two-dimensional characters that only have like character flaws for the sake of making it a bit interesting, but they don't feel fleshed out, they don't feel ingrained in their psyche. They do in this book, and that also contributes to the reason why I love this one so much. I also just appreciate pining and yearning, and this has it in spades. I then also read 2 books from the same series, one full-length novel and one novella. And the full-length book was, of course, A Blood and Fire by Ryan Carhill. This is the first book in the Bound and the Broken series. It has just been traditionally published, and I have ordered the Broken Binding edition, which I think is coming with my March sub. So I will have a finished copy of this soon, but this one was sent to me by the Broken Binding Publishing and also Black Crow PR. So thank you so much. Also invited to the launch event for this one, so I read it around the time of its release. The books in this series are all available on Kindle Unlimited as well. I believe it's going to be a 5-book series. 4 of them, I said 3 in my vlog, but I think 4 of them are already published, as well as maybe 3 of the novellas, and there's 1 or 2 novellas and a full-length novel to come. So I started off by reading this one, and I will say I gave it like 3.5 stars. There was definitely a lot of potential in this, but some of the execution and the writing didn't quite work for me. But then I picked up The Fall, which is the first novella set in this world. 5 stars. I don't like short things, guys. You can't even catch me reading a novella most of the time. I only do it if it's integral to the story, and I've been told that the novellas in this world are incredibly important. I think that The Fall is potentially the least important because it's a prequel. It just gives you a little bit more context, but I was obsessed with that. I ate that up. So I'll get into why in a second, but first off, to tell you a little bit about this series. So this one is very classic fantasy in style. We are predominantly following a guy called Kalen who is coming of age in his village, and he is about to embark on, I think in this it's called The Proven. It's very similar to The Long Night that we have in The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne, and actually a lot of this book, especially in its setup, is very reminiscent to The Faithful and the Fallen. But we are following Kalen as he goes out with his friends to complete this Proven, which is essentially the thing in his society which transitions him from a boy into a man. So he has to go out into the woods and he spends like a night there, and they all have to like hunt something and bring it back, and the person who does the best hunting is like the best at the Proven. But as long as they bring something back, they do complete that transition. So we are following these boys on the cusp of manhood, and we see them kind of go through this, establish their families, their current lives, conflicts that they have within their village. And they very quickly get swept up into this plot that is much wider than them, because in the history of this world, I think I worked out between the main book and the novella, it's like 400 years ago, maybe 600. The Order, who previously ruled the world, this was something that was comprised of dragon riders, magic wielders, there was a lot of like elves, dwarves and giants, were overthrown by the Empire, who betrayed the Order. So some of the key leaders in the Empire are people who were high up in the Order, didn't like the way that the Order were running things, and they overthrew them, they took over, they destroyed all of the dragon eggs. So now the only dragons in the world are controlled by the Emperor and his dragon guard. All of the potential for future, they're not called dragonborns, dragonbound maybe, have been destroyed. So the Order was really pushed onto the back foot. A lot of these races, like the elves, the dwarves, the giants, they're very, very rare in society, especially where Kaelin is from, this small village. He has met one elf in his entire life who is a storyteller that passes through, but he's never met a giant, he's never met a dwarf, and these are things that the majority of people in the world now consider myth and legend because they only really see humans in their everyday lives. So Kaelin and his two friends are accidentally swept along with this resistance force who I think are called the Knights of Acheron, who worship a god called Acheron, and they are kind of trying to re-establish the Order, overthrow the Empire, and restore balance once again. And they find a dragon egg, and they're trying to find the Dragonbound, who is going to be the person that bonds to that dragon and awakens it. So I loved the world in this one. I don't think that I've actually read a really classical style fantasy that has races like elves and dwarves. I have done giants in The Faithful and the Fallen, but like elven and dwarven stuff reminds me of things like Lord of the Rings, which I don't love. I know, how can I be a fantasy reader and not love these series? But I think the issue for me is that I don't like the way that classic fantasy is told. Typically, when we talk about classic fantasy, those classical themes, those classical races go hand in hand with that classical storytelling. But when you get a more modern iteration of it like this, you get the races, you get the world, you get the kind of plot structure, but it is narrated in a different way, which makes it more palatable for me. Now, one of the reasons why classical fantasy doesn't always work for me is that I find it is very, very long-winded, especially in that narration. And one of my actual main criticisms of this is that I don't think it was long-winded enough. So I know I'm a walking contradiction, but essentially this is very, very reminiscent, like I said, of The Faithful and the Fallen, especially in the way that the story is set up. But I also feel like the writing was very, very in line with the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen series. And I'll be honest, I adore that series, but the writing at the beginning, you can tell that it was John Gwyn's first book, and I do feel the same about A Blood and Fire. I feel like the writing in here could do with a little work. I don't feel like it was really engaging me, but this is a series that has grown over years, and I assume that Ryan Carhill's writing style has grown as well. I don't love the main character of Kaelin. He's fine, but for me he fits the same kind of mold as like Rand from Wheel of Time. He's just like this chosen one kind of figure that we are mainly following the narrative through. I do think there are more interesting characters in here at this point, because this book does very closely follow Kaelin. I don't know whether it's going to be a case of all of the books follow him closely and then we just like very briefly spin off to other characters as we did in this one, or whether it is going to be a little bit more like Wheel of Time in that you follow predominantly Kaelin for this book, but then in book 2 maybe we follow a different character more closely and we're constantly just like checking back every now and then on what Kaelin is doing. I do hope that we get to see more of the side characters though. If you've read this book, I am fascinated by Farda, especially based on the way that this book ends and also based on what I read of The Fall, which shook me. I also really like the character of Rist, and I think that that is because he ends up on a different path to a lot of the other characters, and that is something that I'm really interested in exploring and reading from that perspective. I do think that I would have really appreciated if we'd have like lingered in the beats a little bit in this book. There are times where we're kind of passing by civilizations that are inhabited by some of those magical races of the world that like haven't been really seen in centuries, and because of the plot, like the characters are kind of forced to like push past and move on, where I would have liked to kind of linger and explore there a little bit to get a little bit of a richer picture of the world. And I'm hoping, because I know that each installment in this series gets a little bit longer, I'm also hoping that that is something that is to come in the future. Now, The Fall, on the other hand, I was obsessed with, and I think it's because the thing that is most interesting to me when I read fantasy is not actually what is going on in the current moment. It's normally the things that have already happened to put the characters in this position, and The Fall is about the fall of the Order. It is specifically following the conflict that happened at the moment that the Empire overthrew the Order. So I actually expected this to contain maybe a little bit more political context to the climate that caused the Empire to overthrow the Order, but it is actually that specific moment when the Order were betrayed and under attack from the Empire. This is like I think like an 88-page novella on Kindle, and it's split into 4 different narratives that comprise like a quarter of the book. 3 of those narratives were phenomenal. 1 I wasn't as invested in, but I really liked how we switched to these 4 different characters that had a poignant role or something very poignant happen to them during this specific event. I liked that we got some more information about the history of the world. And what I actually really loved about this is there's 2 reading orders of this series, which are actually laid out at the beginning of The Fall. The first one is for the action-based reader, which is definitely not me, and that advises you to read The Fall before A Blood and Fire. However, the reading order for people who like to learn a little bit more about the world and have a slower introduction is to read The Fall after A Blood and Fire, and I actually think that that way is better, because there were things that happened in The Fall that were plot twists, because I saw some characters that I didn't realize were going to be in The Fall 400, 600 years ago pop up there, and now I'm 10 times more invested in them than I was to start off with. So yeah, this had a lot of potential, wasn't obsessed with it, did not blow me away, but The Fall, 10 times more invested in continuing this series now, which I am definitely going to be doing at some point. And like I said, you can read the majority of this series on Kindle Unlimited, but you can also pick up a brand new hardback of Blood and Fire now that it's been traditionally published as well. And then the final book that I read is not a book that I particularly enjoyed, but I do objectively think that it is good, which is The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. So this one, I kept saying I didn't know exactly what genre this was. It says literally on the front, a classic literary thriller, which I think sums this one up quite well. But this is a book that I picked up secondhand many years ago because so many people love it. But it is also something that is very deeply outside of my comfort zone, and I think that is why I didn't love it. But by the time I got to the end and the way everything came together, I appreciated the kind of craft of the novel, if that makes sense. But this one is following a boy whose father, like, it's kind of a rite of passage in his family that the father will take the son to the cemetery of forgotten books. They will pick a book and then they become the guardian of that book. And his family, or his father should I say, because his mother's passed away, does actually also own a second-hand bookstore. So he takes this book and he becomes quite enthralled with it, and he wants to look more into the author, who is Julian Carax, and he discovers that nobody really knows anything about this man. There is a lot of mystery that surrounds him. He did publish other books. None of them were particularly popular. You can't get hold of any of them at this point. They've all disappeared. And he's kind of grown in popularity with a bit of a cult following after his disappearance or his death. And that's kind of been heightened by the fact that his books are so hard to get hold of. So our main character becomes a little bit obsessed with this author, and he's sharing his information, he's sharing his book with people that he knows, and that comes to the attention of the wrong people. And he's approached by a man who goes by the name of a character in one of Julian Carax's books who wants to find all of the books to burn them, and he starts kind of like harassing our main character Danielle to get hold of this book and destroy it. So this only kind of spurs Danielle on, and as he starts digging into the history of Julian Carax, everything becomes more and more complex and complicated, and he ends up on this web that keeps leading him in different directions, and everything forms a small piece of the picture. Now this also serves as a coming of age story for our main character, because when we start this book I think he's 10 or 11. For the bulk of the book he's like his late teens, early 20s, and we see a lot of how his life mirrors Julian's in some quite eerie ways. Like there are definitely parallels that can be drawn between our main character's life and the life of the author that he is so obsessed with. I listened to the audiobook of this, which was recommended to me, and I would definitely recommend that. It doesn't exactly bring the narration to life in a way that's especially showy, but I do think it does a very good job of delivering the voice of our main character. So this is set in 1945 in Spain. It's translated from Spanish, and there is quite a bit of homophobia and sexism within this book. And that is not to say the author or the characters are homophobic or sexist. The homophobia especially, I think it's quite clear in this novel that it is more of a product of the time and people's attitudes towards queer people at the time, more than it is a reflection of the beliefs of the author or the character. The sexism in here, however, I am unsure about. Now, I did have a wonderful comment left on one of my vlogs that gave me a little bit more context into the political climate at the time that this book was set and the way that women were regarded. Now, my issue with the treatment of women in this book is specifically the way that they were viewed by people like our main character, who every woman he encountered, he seemed to make a comment about their bodies. And we are following a boy who is growing into a man, okay? There's a lot of hormones going on there, and we do follow romantic relationships and infatuations that he has along the way. So sexualizing women like that, while I don't love to read it, from the perspective of a boy in the 1940s going through puberty, it does make some kind of sense. But there are different points in this book where like he meets a woman who is old. Like, to be honest, I don't know, because at the time it's set, maybe she's not actually that old, she's just significantly older than him, but she's not depicted as an attractive woman, shall we say. She's depicted as kind of like a withered old lady, and there's still a comment that is made about how he's like looking at the shape of her body through her clothing. And we also have a character in here who forms quite a big part of this story, especially with his relationship with Danielle. He ends up working at the bookshop with Danielle and his father, and the way that he talks about women was also a little bit uncomfortable. Now, I do think that that is a little bit of inherent sexism throughout here. Obviously not all of it, but after I was given kind of the context of the political climate in Spain at the time, I did have a little think about it, and obviously I don't have a great knowledge of that time period, so I can't say for sure, but my interpretation of this is that the women in this book have a lot of agency, and they are not looked down upon, judged, or controlled in any way by the main character who we're following. Like, he does not treat them a certain way because of their own agency. So I'm just editing this video and I wanted to pop in and just correct myself slightly, because there is one character that Danielle meets at the beginning of this book where he's quite young, called Clara, and he does treat her horribly. The way that he views her and the way that he thinks that she's supposed to behave and the way that that differs from the way that she actually behaves causes him to think of her quite harshly. I do, however, put this down to a product of him at the age that he's at. Essentially, she is considerably older than him. She's in her early 20s. He's like 13 or 14 or something like that, and he develops a crush on her, which she obviously does not reciprocate. She is kind of doing her own thing, living her own life, and the way that he treats her because of how she feels, like he feels like she has betrayed him almost because she isn't beholden to this infatuation that he has with her, causes him to treat her and judge her quite harshly. But when he grows up throughout the bulk of this book, the way that he treats women is not with like judgment for things like promiscuity or telling them what they should and should not do, where they can and can't go, if that makes sense. Like, he is not treating them or looking at them or judging them in a certain way because of their actions and their behaviors, because they're doing things that not typical women would of the time period. That is actually quite normalized and often encouraged by our main character, in the same way that we see the homophobia from other characters within this world, but that is not something that the main character is expressing. That's how he treats women in terms of their actions. Like, we see a lot of instances of women's lives being controlled by their husbands and also by their fathers, but from the good guys of this book, like the people that we're following, we don't see that prejudice, but we still have that consistent sexualization, even of women who are not forming that sexualized role within the novel. So that did make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's not the sole reason why I didn't enjoy this book. I just did want to talk about that a little bit because I feel like there's a layer of complexity there and also nuance where you could interpret it in different ways, and I kind of wanted to express that that's kind of the way that I interpreted that and why. But obviously when we're dealing with older books like this, we do, especially written by men like you do, still encounter quite a bit of that inherent sexism. This, I think, to me, because it did have that coming of age element to it, that is the reason why I didn't enjoy this book. It did read like a classic, I would say, typically something like The Great Gatsby. I would say this narrative reminded me of, where we are following a character who is experiencing a series of things that are happening to them, but the narrative actually predominantly follows them viewing somebody else. In this case, we are in Danielle's viewpoint, following his life, but actually the purpose of this is that we are learning more about Julian Carax. And by the time we get to the end of this book and everything started adding up and we'd followed all of these different elements of Julian's life, I did really like how this story came together, but it was the narrative of so closely following Danielle that I didn't really have so much of a good time with throughout the course of this. It was the coming of age portion that I didn't gel with and I was less interested in, but especially like the way these puzzle pieces fit together towards the end of the book, forming this picture of Julian's life, I did really enjoy. So I ended up giving this like a low 4-star rating. There was a lot that I enjoyed about it, especially that way that it came together and the way that we had all of these little pieces that kind of eventually molded together, but the narrative choice of so closely following Danielle and his life was just not personally that interesting to me, which is kind of where we have my torn feelings on this one. So these are all of the books that I finished in February. I did start 2 more books that I got quite a bit of the way through. However, they are the first 2 books for the next episode of Shelve It or Scrap It. So instead of mentioning them, I'll just let you guys be surprised when that episode drops, which hopefully should be coming within the next week. And down in my comments, let me know if you've read any of these books and what you guys thought of them. And if you guys would like to just let me know you were here, but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me, I'm gonna say a raven emoji. I'm pretty sure there is one. If not, just any kind of bird emoji for the Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon, and also like my TikTok and stuff as well, if you wanna follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.